Good evening. I'm Nishi Shah. I'm a professor of philosophy here at Amherst College. Welcome to the second of the 3-point counterpoint events this semester. This conversation series, made possible by a gift of 36 members of the 50th reunion class of 1970, supports public conversation between those with differing views in the hopes of bridging the growing ideological divide in our nation and helping us all think more carefully about the most important issues facing us. This year's theme is progress, and the series takes place in conjunction with a course by the same name in which 20% of our first years are enrolled. I don't know how many of you know who Alexander Meiklejohn was, but I think he would have been a passionate supporter of this wonderful series. Meiklejohn, who was president of Amherst College from 1912 to 1923, was a famous advocate of free speech and the need to hear conflicting viewpoints. One of my favorite quotes of his occurred during a famous debate in 1949 with Sidney Hook over the question, should communists be allowed to teach? It was a difficult debate to have in 1949. Meiklejohn summed up his case by stating that faith in freedom expresses our confidence that whenever in the field of ideas the advocates of freedom and the advocates of suppression meet in fair and unabridged discussion, freedom will win. If that were not true, he crucially added, if the intellectual program of democracy could not hold its own in fair debate, then that program itself would require its own abandonment. That chance we believers in self-government have determined to take. We have put our faith in democracy, end quote. Well, this evening, to help reinvigorate our faith in humanity's ability to use its freedom wisely, we have here with us Stephen Carter and Nicholas Christakis. Stephen Carter is the William Nelson Cromwell Professor of Law at Yale. He's the author of several best-selling novels and acclaimed works of nonfiction, including most recently, Invisible, the forgotten story of the black woman lawyer who took down America's most powerful mobster. At Yale, Carter teaches courses on law and religion, lying and secrets, and the ethics of warfare, among many other topics. He's published dozens of articles in law reviews and many op-ed columns in the nation's leading newspapers. The New York Times Book Review hailed him one of America's leading public intellectuals. Nicholas Christakis is also a professor at Yale University, where he is the Saul Goldman Family Professor of Social and Natural Science. He was elected to the National Academy of Medicine in 2006 and was named one of Time magazine's 100 most influential people in the world in 2009. His path-breaking research has appeared on the front pages of the New York Times, Washington Post, USA Today, and other venues. Daniel Gilbert, author of Stumbling on Happiness, said this about Christakis' most recent book, which will be our point of departure for our conversation tonight. The book is called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. So what Gilbert said about this book was, a masterful achievement that is surely the best and most original science book of the year. Please join me in welcoming Professor Christakis and Professor Carter to the stage.
There are many reasons people obey the law. But one of them is that law is enforceable by people who carry guns. Having said that, however, I don't agree that our politics are worse today than they've ever been. And I hope that wasn't an implication, because as I told the group earlier, we had a civil war. Don't forget. Our politics have been worse than they are now, and the country survived. And so as bad as things are.
I'm copying him. How many of you heard one of us earlier today? About half or a third, maybe.
Before we start, can I explain what I thought Meiklejohn got wrong in that quote?
Sure.
I'm serious, that there's part of a tradition, Holmes was in this tradition as well, Oliver Holmes, that said the reason we can tolerate speech we don't like is because they're not going to win anyway, because it's so unimportant in effect. I do believe we should tolerate speech that we don't like, but it's not because they won't win any. Sometimes the good guys lose. This is part of life, and I don't think that we should pretend that it's any other way. That's all. But so I don't think the best argument for tolerating hateful speech is that they're not going to win anyway, because they could.
Yeah, although I agree with that, but I would say that if one is so confident in the strength of one's ideas, you should be willing to do battle and win the battle of ideas.
I agree with that entirely.
You could lose.
I agree entirely, but that's why you enter the battle, understanding that while I think I'm going to win, I believe I ought to win, I might not win.
Yes.
But the battle is important. I agree with that completely. Sorry to go off script.
Maybe I interpreted Meiklejohn a little bit differently, because I thought he said, look, if we do lose the battle of ideas, then we should fold. So it seemed to me that he was open to that.
Yeah, but there's chance too, right? I mean, you could lose due to stochastic elements.
Yes.
Sure.
Me?
I don't. Are we able?
Someone
to
in the
turn
back
mics?
has to control that.
I don't think. There's a volume control. Look at that. I don't know. Maybe
Am I
it's
okay?
not. No, I don't know what it does.
I don't know. Can you hear me now? There you go.
Okay.
I feel great now.
Oh.
Okay.
Now I'm in trouble. Well, it's
Being
less
silenced.
Well, so I thought I would start with a question for you, Professor Christakis, about your book. So you began the book with a quite powerful but unsettling story involving your mother, your brother, and you. And I thought you might just start us off by telling us what that story was, what that incident was, and why you chose to start the book with it.
Okay, that's an unexpected development, but I'll tell you the story as quickly as I can. So it's sort of odd that I've spent my professional career studying collective action problems, how groups of people have properties that transcend the individuals within them, or how groups behave, or how groups might properly be governed or organized. So those are intellectual questions I'm interested in, despite the fact that my whole life I've really detested crowds and not been interested in being in a crowd and interested in sort of being apart from crowds. And so I opened the book with this particular event in my life. I was born in the United States, but I was Greek ethnically, and we used to go back to Greece when I was a little boy, and I spoke Greek, and my mother was a very impressive person in many ways, and she was a very progressive person and was very invested in our education. She used to take us to civil rights marches in the 60s when I was a boy in Washington, D.C., which kind of disturbed me. I was scared, to be in these big crowds. Anyway, this particular summer, 1974, we had gone to Greece for the summer, and the junta that had been in power since 1967 unexpectedly fell from power. And in the run-up, Konstantinos Karamanlis was returning from Paris, where he had been in exile, was returning to Athens, or about to return to Athens, and the junta during the day had sent out soldiers with guns in trucks into the streets, saying, "People of Athens, this doesn't concern you, stay indoors." And my mother was not going to have any of that, nor were millions of other citizens. And the people, including my mother, went out into the streets. And so close to midnight, I would estimate, maybe at 10 or 11 p.m., my mother takes me and my younger brother, I was 12, he was 10, out into the streets that are packed with people in this very fraught, tense situation. And we walked down from my grandfather's house where we were staying down towards the Constitution Square, Syntagma Square in the central Athens. And we get about a block away from the square, maybe 2 blocks, where there was the national park, the sort of used to be the royal gardens of Greece, and there was this big stone wall with this metal railing above it that sort of kept the animals on the other side. And my mother boosted us up, me and my younger brother, onto this little ledge, and we're standing there with our back against it, and the crowd is just being swept into this frenzy, and they're yelling and screaming, down with the torturers. There was a horrible prison that they were talking about, and Exoi Americani, which means out with the Americans, because Americans had been meddling in Greek politics and supporting the junta, and screaming. And I couldn't understand why everyone was so angry and so visibly upset. I thought we were out there for like a celebration, like this was supposed to be a good news event. And at some point I became very worried that the crowd would shift and my mother we would be separated from her, in the middle of Athens. And while I was having all these thoughts, and again I remind you that my mother was just loved her children and was really committed to our education to the point where she wanted us to witness this historic event and is out with her, just the 3 of us are out in the city. My mother, at some point, I'm looking down at her, she looks up, and while the crowd is screaming, down with the Americans, out with the Americans, she points up at me and my little brother and she goes, Nai Americani, there are the Americans. And I had been raised on a diet rich in Greek mythology, and I'm sure I was thinking of Medea at that moment, who cut up her children with Jason because he was a faithless, feckless bastard, and angry at him, she cut her children into bits and threw them off the boat. So I'm sure this is the image that was crossing my mind at that time. Why on earth? What could possibly have possessed my mother to do this? And that's how I open the book.
The reason I asked you that
and
was...
I'm not going to say more in case you want to buy the book.
the reason I asked you that was I wondered whether that... as you acknowledge, you didn't know what she had in mind when she said that, but you chose the optimistic attitude. And I wondered whether that might have someone might think that's emblematic of the book, is your attitude of optimism, because the sort of the glass half full attitude. I wonder what you think of this. So you amass all this data, and on the basis of that, you say, although we're prone to violence and selfishness, we are sort of fundamentally built to be good. And I wonder whether a pessimist might just say, yeah, I see all the data, and I see that we're prone to altruism and cooperation, but we're fundamentally built to be evil. And I just wonder whether your thesis is actually a rational response to the evidence you've presented, or it's more of a choice. So, I can imagine someone writing the book. So you wrote, the book is called Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. Might not a pessimist just write Blueprint, The Evolutionary Origins of an Evil Society, with the same data?
No, they couldn't do it with the same data, but when I was originally planning the book, I had much more megalomaniacal ambitions, and the title was like The Evolutionary Origins of Human Civilization or something, which is crazy. And for a variety of reasons, my wife reined me in. And as I began to think more deeply about the book, I realized a couple of things. I realized, first of all, that there had been a lot of attention when people think about the role of natural selection in human social organization. We tend to think of both the people on the street and scientists tend to think of evil, right? The origins of, as you're suggesting, origins of hatred and violence and selfishness and tribalism and so forth. And I thought that the good part of our evolutionary heritage had been denied the attention it deserved. And furthermore, and here's my answer to your question, I believe that this good part is actually more powerful than the bad part. And that's the evidence that the book presents. And just as a toy or a quick way of summarizing why that's the case, and it's just from a kind of a thought experiment kind of way. If you imagine that every time I came near you, you told me lies, you were mendacious, or you hurt me, or you killed me, I would be better off living as a solitary animal. So the very fact that we don't live as solitary animals, as many other species do, suggests that the benefits of a connected life must outweigh the costs. So we are prone to all these horrible things, but we have more powerful good things, is what I would argue.
So it's interesting. That was the answer, because I had a similar question. I'd say I enjoyed the book very much, and I do think it's a wonderful achievement. You all really should buy it. No, I'm serious. But let me press on this point a little bit more. If one of the things you talk about throughout the book, starting when you discuss the social suite and in many places later on, is how although we are, you think, and I may make a pretty persuasive case, that there is enormous evolutionary pressure to be, for example, altruistic. It's a bounded altruism. It's an altruism in the service of the in-group, out-group competition. It's not just that, so that it's that the, as you describe it, the goodness, the good we do others evolves hand in hand with the battle for scarce resources. And I think about this, let me jump toward a later part of the book. In your chapter about friendship, which is actually my favorite chapter of the book, although it did make me say, why don't I have 4 friends? You know, there was that. But in the chapter about friendship, it strikes me, you have that section where you talk about how people seem to hate fewer people than they like. And that was one place, maybe the one spot in the book where I wasn't sure that I was persuaded. I wasn't sure that you had it on the data, given the particular situation in which you did the experiments. And I wondered, especially because you have a very, if I could call it that, what my father would have called a 19th century view of friendship, that friendship involves sacrifice. My father used to say that a friend is the person who, if you bang on the door in the middle of the night and say, hide me, they won't say who's after you, they'll shove you under the bed and lie about where you are. And I wonder if that kind of friendship is not in decline, the kind of friendship that's sacrificial in, I'm not saying I know that it is, I'm saying I often wonder that, since that was my father's ideal, if that kind of friendship is not in decline, and if there's a rise in people's, if not people they hate who they know, in people's enemies lists, let's put it that way, and if that is true, what are the implications for your theory?
Well, first of all, on the friendship thing, one of the things that's so interesting is that friendship is a cultural universal. It's seen in every society. And other social mammals have independently evolved this capacity. You all take for granted that we have friends, but it's actually, friends are long-term non-reproductive unions with other members of our species who are not related to us. This is very rare. We do it, elephants do it, certain cetacean species do it, certain primates, not even all primates do it. So it's an evolved capacity that we have, and very interestingly, the kind of social networks you all make, whether online or face-to-face, mathematically resemble the social networks that, let's say, elephants make, and our last common ancestor with elephants is 85 million years ago, so those elephants independently evolved this capacity for friendship. So the argument is that friendship is universal, that we evolved to have this remarkable quality, that and that not only that, but that the attributes of friendship are not quite as universal, but they're very common. So mutual aid, for example, is not seen, in fact, universally, or positive sentiment, that you feel good about your friends or good in their presence, for example, that these qualities are also part of our evolved psychology. So I would argue that that friendship is universal. Now, the animosity thing is much more troubling to me, because why do we have enemies? I mean, why do you have the cognitive capacity to remember who means you ill, or who you mean ill to? That you're devoting brain power to that. There's very little that's done, by chance in evolution. And I mean, we can get into an discussion about that. There are some things, etc. But I know those things. Anyway, we're not going to talk about that right now. But so it begs the question of, like, well, do we have a reason? Why don't we just remember our friends and then everyone else is a stranger? Or why do we remember our friends and be indifferent to the people who mean us ill? Why do we devote so much ability to have enemies? And and we do, and they're less common, our enemies, than our friends. And I think that in my optimistic way, I think that there is a reason for this, and the reason goes something like this. This is speculation, that that the existence of repulsive forces in social systems, in addition to attractive forces in social systems, barring, for example, some ideas from physics where you can imagine, attractive and repulsive, for example, magnetic forces in a field, is that it serves to add structure to a human population. The gist of the idea is that the ability to have some antagonistic ties helps partition us into groups. And partitioning us into groups then has a purpose of containing the flow of pathogens and facilitating collective action. This is a theory.
Okay.
It could easily be wrong, but that's one set of ideas as to why we're endowed with this capacity. Anyway, I kind of danced around your question. I didn't really nail it. But anyway, that's what some thoughts on antagonism.
Well, I wonder,
Just buried under his question is this issue of groupiness, which was part of the conversation in our part of the session earlier today. And as I told the group, that the young people that heard me earlier today, this predilection, this so-called in-group bias, or the fact that we prefer the company of people we resemble, we prefer the company of people in our own group, however defined, this capacity we have to draw arbitrary distinctions. And I also, early in the book, I give the example of famous experiments done by psychologists where little children are randomly assigned different colored T-shirts, and they know that it's been done. They didn't deserve these T-shirts. It's by chance. And the little children given purple T-shirts come to hate the children given green T-shirts for no reason. Those kids are awful children. They should be punished. They don't deserve toys. So it's very easy to cultivate. You just scratch human beings and you can get them to hate other groups. And this is why Fascism 101 or Totalitarianism 101, you blame the Jews, or you blame the Roma, or you blame the Mexicans, right? This is a classic tactic that is employed to get political power, because it's such a fundamental aspect that we have that we can easily come to dislike not us groups. So the existence of this quality in human beings, which has its own history and reason why we are this way, is a very depressing aspect of our humanity. And so I think Stephen was alluding to that. This downside, if as it were, of our nature.
But that was, I guess, the question both of us were asking. In the sense, it's a part of our nature, but it follows, it seems to me, from the notion, I said, that the altruism, that's why his phrase, the question that is in service of promoting the interests of the in-group. And so if altruism is a good, it's part of the good society, we should be altruistic, but we tend to be altruistic toward the people
our group,
to help our side win. In effect, which suggests, and you sort of say this in the book, that you need an out-group in order to have altruism.
Some people, yes, that's right. So there's some theories, I discussed this in my half, I keep forgetting we had different halves this morning, but one of the theories as to the evolution of this capacity to draw distinctions between one group and another and to care about them, which are two different capacities, to see the difference and to care about the difference, is that it evolved hand in hand to facilitate the emergence of cooperation. So the toy example I gave earlier in the morning was, imagine I told everyone in this audience, you're part of a group of 1,000 people and you must cooperate, be nice to everyone else. You would say, that's an impossible task. There are too many of them. There's not enough of me. I can't be nice to all of them. If I'm nice to them, I won't know if I'll ever see them again. Will they be nice back to me? They won't reciprocate the niceness. I can't track them, etc. So if instead we say we divide this group of 1,000 into 10 groups of 100, and we give them little flags, with different, purple and green colors or something, and yellow and orange and whatever, and we say, okay, you just be nice to the group that has your flag color. And here I'm not making an allusion to skin color. I'm just saying any arbitrary category. And now you tell everyone, just collaborate with the people in your own group. So in the previous circumstance, you would have had no cooperation. No one would have been nice to anyone, zero altruism. But now, having done something that the evolutionary biologists call adding structure to the population, by adding structure to the population, now all of a sudden everyone has a simpler tasks. They only have to collaborate with, be nice to 100 people. Therefore, everyone is more cooperative. Therefore, you get more cooperation. So you're exactly right. The theory is that this in-group bias, this attention to who is in our group and who is not in our group, evolved hand in hand with the ability to be cooperative. Now, the notion of having a conflict with other groups is contested. It may not, some people believe that conflict between groups was necessary for the emergence of cooperation. Other people think it was just sufficient for the emergence of cooperation. And I'm in the category that thinks it was sufficient, not necessary, because I'm an optimist.
Let me ask sort of a related question. So you've mentioned, you might want to say a little bit more about this because not everyone's read the book, but I think at the heart of your book is this idea that there's this thing called the social suite, which are 8 characteristics that are sort of underwritten by our genetic endowment, and that they're responsible for for the existence of stable and good societies. And I guess I was a little puzzled by that because it seems to me that you can explain stability with these characteristics, or you can explain morally good societies, but you can't really explain both, because after all, their history is littered with societies that are stable, but are morally repugnant, where there are massive injustices, most people live in misery and servitude. So I'm curious how, maybe this is more a question about how to understand your thesis.
Well, I kind of addressed that earlier in the day, but I'll try to repeat the answer and add some embellishments. So you would say, in fact, I would like to mention Philippa Foot and the naturalistic fallacy. So we'll come back to that. If I asked you whether intelligence was good, you would all probably think it's good to be smart. Or if I asked you if strength is good, you would say it's good to be strong. But that doesn't say anything about the purpose to which those abilities are put. You could be a strong, smart murderer who effectively kills other people. So we shouldn't conflate these capacities with the purpose to which they are put. And as I said this morning, the Nazis had friends and were cooperative with each other, and they had mild hierarchy or even maybe major hierarchy, etc. They had a lot of these qualities, but they put them in the service of some evil objective. So my argument is only that we have these capacities which we would call good. Now, then we get into the naturalistic fallacy issue. And here I would invoke, and you can elaborate because I'm sure you'll know this better than I do, or you surely will know this better than I do too, which is that there's this famous essay that Philippa Foot, a moral philosopher, wrote that opens with a very provocative sentence, which is, in moral philosophy, I think, it's helpful to think about plants. What does she mean by that? And she uses the metaphor of plants having good roots. So the moral philosophers after the Second World War, there was all these British moral philosophers returned from, actually many of them were imprisoned in many of these camps, and they said, how can moral philosophy possibly be grounded in any kind of objective reality? Isn't it just all about what they called boo and hurrah? It's just like a voting, it's arbitrary, like we all agree that this is a good thing or we agree it's a bad thing. And so they're really struggling with this in the post-war period. And one of the streams of thought that emerges from this period is the argument that we can speak of good traits when acting against constraints. And so, for example, maternal death during childbirth is, well, never mind, that's another famous example, but let me leave that. So let me stick with the plant example. So Philippa Foot says, look, we can make a statement about whether the roots of a plant are good or not when we understand what does it mean to be a plant and what is the purpose of the roots. And if the purpose of the roots is to nourish the plants, then we can make a statement, a moral statement about these are good roots. They make the plant thrive. And so I grasp this thin reed at the end of the book to explain why I think these can label these qualities of friendship and cooperation and so forth as good, because they are in the service of, against what? For what reason do we have these traits? They are necessary traits in order to live socially. So they are traits that are required to have a functioning society, to allow us to fulfill what is the purpose of living together.
So that suggests that the subtitle is too short. That is because it's not so much the evolutionary origins of a good society, it's the evolutionary origins of the traits that allow us
Yes,
to
the
form good
capacity for
society.
this. Yes.
Because those traits can be used, because all of this can be used for other purposes. But that's, you mentioned Philippa Foot, and in a sense, this is what she gets into also. I mean, there's interesting questions. So, given that they can be used for good or for ill, I'm still going back to your original question issue. The question that sticks with me is, I'm not sure I would agree that there are long-term stable evil societies, at least as measured against the kinds of things we're talking about here. Some of them are unstable, which is why it takes so much force to keep them going. But it is the case that there have been a lot of bad societies. And so in the chapter, which I think was assigned to students about the shipwrecks, I mean, some of those stories are terrible. That people formed sort of functional societies, they formed dreadful oppressive societies, they formed all kinds of different things. And it just strikes me, if you look at the world, you get all kinds of different things as well. I'm not disputing any of the traits, and I certainly have the scientific knowledge to argue with any of the evidence. I just wonder if it is if your own optimistic spirit is driving the story. And I'm an optimist too. I believe in optimism. I am, as the economist Tyler Cowen would say, I am pessimistic about pessimism, and I'm optimistic about optimism. But I wonder the extent to which you're clearly an optimistic soul, the extent to which that drives at hard places in the analysis.
I would cop to that, I suppose. I mean, I try to be objective, but we all of us carry with us our baggage.
But if you when you're not objective, and I'm not saying there's any particular place I'm pointing to, you tend to be not objective in the direction of, but we have this capacity for good.
Yes, or mostly I would just say it's where I direct my gaze. So I would rather study good things than bad things, and there's plenty of both in the world. So I'll give you another example. So when I started my career, I was trained both as a physician and as a sociologist, and I was a hospice doctor. So for up until about 10 years ago, I took care of people who were dying, and I started my career at the University of Chicago, where I was the assistant medical director of a hospice called Horizon Hospice. Anyway, and at the time I was doing a lot of work on physician prognostication, on how doctors predict when a patient is going to die, which itself has, well, anyway, I had particular reasons for having that interest. And then I got into issues of decision-making at the end of life, and I got into how we could organize, because we have awful terminal care in our society. 40 to 70% of Americans die in pain, which is just unconscionable in our society. We're a rich society. We have a healthcare system. It should not be happening. Anyway, so I got involved in policy to improve the end-of-life care in our society, and I was getting very depressed. And again, my beloved wife came to me after I'd been doing this work for 5 years and says, "This is ridiculous. All you do is study death and destruction. You're taking care of people that are dying. Can't you do something else in your laboratory? Study something else, for the love of God." And I had just gone to England. This was in 1996 or something, and I had gone to meet Dame Cicely Saunders, the founder of the modern hospice movement in England, and I met her assistant there, and he told me that the Bureau of Vital Statistics in England is called Hatch, Match, and Dispatch. Birth, marriage, and death. Hatch, match, and dispatch. And so I figured I was tired of studying dispatch. I had no reason or ability to study hatch, so I would study match. I would start studying marriage. And so then I made an abrupt shift and started studying the health benefits of marriage. And then that eventually led to an interest in friendship and so forth.
Maybe I'll switch gears just a
Yes,
little bit.
please. Let's make Stephen the focus of attention.
Oh, okay, sure. How about, maybe we'll come back to your book.
I like being able to say, but what about this? What about this?
So now we're going to do that with you. So I want to switch gears. So in the late 90s, you wrote a great book called Civility, in which you lamented the decline of civility in our country. I kind of wonder whether you now think,
even
wow,
worse.
those were the good old days. So maybe just to start off, I was wondering if you could sort of tell us a little bit about what you mean by civility, why you think it's so important, because you clearly do, and if you have a thought about how we got to the place we are now and maybe where we're going.
Wow. Okay. So I did write this book called Civility, and I've written 17 books, and this is still my favorite book after all this time. But it's also the one that's most likely to bring me almost to tears when I think about it. The subtitle of my book, Civility, is Manners, Morals, and the Etiquette of Democracy. I'm interested in the relationship between civility and democracy. That was something I was studying at the time, something that I wrote about. For many years, my literary agent and my various editors have been after me to write a sequel to the book Civility, or an update at least, and I haven't because I don't think I might buy it. I think I would read it. At least that's my thought about it. But let me make 3 points about civility. When I wrote about civility, I've written about it since in other respects. I'm not writing about manners as such, although I believe manners matter. I'm writing about a modus vivendi. I'm writing about a way of living together. I define civility in the book as the sum total of all the sacrifices we make for the sake of living a common life. And I have two great heroes of civility, and I will very briefly tell you each of their stories. The first hero is a woman none of you, I suspect, will have heard of. The second hero, all of you will have heard of. Her name was Sarah Kestenbaum. When I was a kid, we moved out of a mostly black neighborhood of Washington, D.C. into an all-white neighborhood of Washington, D.C. And when I say it was all-white, what I mean is that for miles in every direction at the time, there were no black families. We were the only one. At that time, we were the only black family in Washington, north of the cathedral, and west of Connecticut Avenue and east of Massachusetts Avenue.
Where was your address?
Wisconsin Avenue. We're on Macomb Street.
Oh my God, I lived right near you. I was on Huntington
Oh,
Street.
well, see, we
On
at the time,
39th, Macomb and what?
34th.
Oh my God, we're like 6 blocks apart.
Oh, something like
Yes.
that. So, we're a little further apart, but okay.
I think I remember when you moved in.
Yeah, you do. Okay. So we moved in, and there were five.
He's right about his description.
There were 5 kids in the family, and we were all miserable. The day we sat there, we had this neighborhood with all these friends and so on of multiple ethnic backgrounds, and now we're going to go to these all-white schools, and they were all white. When I started my junior high school, out of the 1,800 kids, when my brother and I arrived, we doubled the number of black kids in the school. So when I say it was all white, I'm not making that up. Anyway, so we're sitting on the front porch of the house, our new house, watching the movers bring in their furniture. Excuse me. And we're sitting there saying, this is going to be horrible. This is going to be dreadful. And then there's this voice from across the street saying, "Welcome!" And this big hand wave. This was Sarah Kestenbaum, who would get to know very well later on. And she comes across the street with this big plate of cream cheese and jelly sandwiches. And I always remembered that. I'd written about it before in tribute to her, and then I wrote about it in the Civility book as a kind of sacrifice for the sake of living a common life. No one else in the neighborhood welcomed us. One person did. That's one of my heroes of civility. The other one I want to mention, you will have heard of, is Thurgood Marshall. I was a law clerk for Thurgood Marshall at the Supreme Court. This is, of course, a long time ago. And in the year before he died, I was the interviewer for his official oral history. When I asked him why he chose me as his interviewer, he said he liked to live dangerously. That was what he said. And he never explained what he meant by that. We didn't finish oral history. He died before we could finish, but we did finish what I think was the more important part, which is the part about what he did before he was on the Supreme Court. And one of the things I really valued from him, learned from him, was about the value of looking at people, even those who are against us, in a complexity that's greater than what it is they happen to stand for or believe. He used to, I remember I asked him once, when Browning's Board of Education was being argued, Thurgood Marshall and several other NAACP lawyers argued, of course, on the side of desegregation. The segregationists hired a man who was thought at the time to be the best lawyer in America. His name was John W. Davis. He had been a presidential candidate years later. A law firm in New York was named for him, one of the big law firms, and he had argued something like 300 or 400 cases before the Supreme Court, winning the great majority of them. He was also an old West Virginia gentleman who genuinely believed in separation of the races. So they hired him to argue for the other side. And I asked Thurgood Marshall once, and of course this was many, many years after Davis had died, what he thought of John W. Davis. He said he was a good man. He said he was a great man. He was a great man who happened to believe in that segregation, as he used to call it. And he wasn't being facetious. There was a quality that Marshall had of looking across even what I consider the greatest American crime of the 20th century and seeing common humanity on the other side. And one of the advantages of that was that he was able to do business with people on the other side. He would tell stories about backroom deals with the most notoriously segregationist Southern politicians that he was able to make because he wasn't sitting there being hostile. What was the point? He was there to try to make a deal. He'd sit there, they'd play cards, they would drink liquor, as he used to say, and they would make deals about various things. And he lamented, and so we're talking decades ago, he was lamenting that these new people, as he kept calling them, by which I think he meant people like me, my age, I was young then, and that these new people didn't believe in that anymore, that making deals like that wasn't so important to them. What was important to them was not finding any commonality. Well, my view is that democracy requires a finding of commonality across our differences. Otherwise, the enterprise doesn't make any sense. Otherwise, the enterprise is reduced simply to voting and does become a winner-take-all type enterprise. And I've written and lectured about voting a lot, and one of the points I often make about voting is the point of voting in democracy is not simply or even mostly, I think, so my side can win. It's a sacrifice. It's a sacrifice one lays on the altar of democracy. One says, I will take my most cherished convictions and put them up to a popular vote if you will do the same with yours. And that's why you vote. Voting is not mainly a tool to try to win. It is a sacrifice because it symbolizes the willingness to lose. So when I think of the set of sacrifices that we make for the sake of living common life, that's the kind of stuff I'm talking about. I don't think manners are unimportant. I think manners are very important, but that's not what the book is about.
So
that was a very long answer, but it was a very open-ended question.
Yeah. So let me be maybe a little bit more specific. So I asked it so I could raise a couple of objections. I think one that maybe a lot of our students are thinking about because they're currently all writing a paper on Freud. And Freud famously thinks that one of our fundamental drives is to aggression. We like violence. We like humiliating other people. And this is why he thinks civilization...
No, we're altruistic toward the in-group. That's our fundamental drive.
We're also that, maybe, but we also have this aggressive instinct. And this is why he thinks, this is maybe a claim about the cost of civilization. I don't think Freud thinks we'd be better outside of civilization, but I think he thinks civilization, and certainly being sort of forced to be civil, is always going to make us somewhat miserable. So that's one kind of thought. Another kind of thought, which I think maybe I take more seriously, is one that, so John Stuart Mill on Liberty, he warned against legislating, either by law or by social coercion, civility, really, because he said, look, historically, civility has been a tool of the majority to oppress the minority. It's almost always minority speech that gets castigated as uncivil. So just as a sort of empirical truth about human beings, putting too much pressure on civility and touting it too much might just be a way of sort of shutting down minority voices. I was curious of what you thought about either of those thoughts.
You won't be surprised to learn that I don't buy them, but let's take them in order. Civility makes us miserable in the same sense that law makes us miserable. There's only two kinds of laws: laws that say you have to do what you don't want to do, and laws that say you can't do what you do want to do. Every law falls into one of those categories. So there's always somebody who's going to say, well, I feel otherwise. I am strongly committed, for reasons you couldn't possibly understand, to driving on the left. And the fact that you won't let me do that fills me with rage. I buy that. That's possible. That's possible. I've seen people practically go to war over the colors they paint their houses. I mean, their neighbors paint their houses. My color is always fine. It's your color that's ruining the neighborhood. But you decide you want to live in a society or you don't want to live in a society. And in a society, people rub elbows against each other. And either we're going to constantly get into fistfights when we rub elbows, or we're going to find ways to live together. There's nothing to do with whether you make nice or not. It has to do with whether you find the fundamental human connection, including in strangers. I talk a lot in the book about the notion that civility is a tool of oppression. That's true in a kind of trivial sense. Again, everything is. Law is a tool of oppression. You say there should be no laws because look how many bad things have been done with law. Slavery was a legal status, therefore it was a tool of oppression by law, therefore there shouldn't be any law. That is, it strikes me as a similar kind of argument. More to the point, however, what was striking about, let's take the slave South, was how uncivil it was. If you looked at the way that the rules operated, it was striking the difference in the amount of respect, for example, both in the slave South and in the aftermath, difference in the amount of respect that a black person on the street owed a white person, the white person on the street owed a black person. It was those differences were enshrined as in civility. They were enshrined as ways to show that we don't, in fact, live a common life, that some people's lives are more valuable, are more important, are more to be respected and admired than others. If the question is about the shutting down of minority speech, that's not a matter of civility or incivility. That's what majorities do everywhere. And it's whether they are a majority, in the McCarthy era, or majority on campus. Majorities are constantly shouting down minorities, and they always have a good reason for it, and good in their own minds. And my view is that it's always a very dangerous thing to do. And part of the respect that we owe each other is to trust each other, to puzzle through competing arguments as we try to figure out what we ourselves want to believe. If we cannot trust each other to puzzle through competing arguments, to figure out what we're going to believe and how, then I think it's incorrect to call ourselves democracy, whatever else we may call ourselves. It's just flatly wrong. And the eras of enormous repression of speech have been eras precisely when people aren't trusted to make up their own minds. What was striking about the McCarthy era, again, you talked about the debate with Sidney Hook, was the sense was we can't even allow people to be exposed to this stuff. I mentioned earlier today, and I also mentioned to people at lunch, my great uncle was a communist, and I don't mean he was falsely accused of being a communist. He was a real communist. He was a serious, committed, tear down the West, do favors for Soviet intelligence communist. And he was basically run out of the country. As I mentioned at lunch day, he had gone to Harvard, he had a PhD from NYU, he was an expert in Tennyson, and after he went to prison for his views in the 1950s, he couldn't get a job. He couldn't get a job. He'd been run out of the academy because his views were too dangerous. People shouldn't hear this stuff, was basically the view. Everybody likes to shut down debate. I will be the friend of anyone from any political position who's being told you've got to shut up because your ideas are dangerous, and that's my family history. That's me thinking about my great uncle, and I write about this a lot. And when I write defending somebody on the right. I get angry letters from the left when I get emails. Defending somebody on the left, I get emails from the right. But it's just, I think it's crucial to democracy, and a lot of the civility book is about exactly that. It's about trying to decide things through the give and take rather than trying to take ideas off the table.
And I too will stand with his shoulder to shoulder with him and do exactly the same thing. I think when I have debates with people on campus about free expression, I challenge them to identify a view they strongly disagree with, whose expression on campus they would strongly support. And if you can't do that, then you're not actually defending free expression. You're just defending the expression of views you endorse. So that's the challenge. Like, who do you strongly disagree with that you would fight for them to be able to speak? I want to piggyback on the question, the J.S. Mill thing that you said. I think, and agree again with Stephen on this, I think that actually civility is not a tool of oppression against minority, and here I don't mean ethno-racial minority, like we're all talking about, like minority viewpoints. I think it is actually a tool of power, because what is the alternative? The majority has the gun and the vote in its favor. Are we going to resolve our disputes by fighting? I mean, do we want a world in which the more powerful are the ones that win? Are we going to resolve our disputes by voting? Okay, but then you have the tyranny of the majority. This is why the founders enshrined certain constitutional principles which privilege the minority. So the protection of free expression is for the minority. And to the extent that civility means something like tolerating disagreement, or I love the expression, making the sacrifice for democracy, tolerating the prospect that we might lose, I think that actually is a tool for the minority, not a tool for the majority. So I totally reject this claim that, and it's become so crazy, like you hear people saying that reason is like a tool for a majority, or mathematics is like a tool for the majority to oppress the minority. These are nonsense claims that really don't hold up under any kind of scrutiny and don't leave any kind of alternative, in my view.
I agree with most of that, but I do want to say that although I don't agree with the claim that some people make about forms of reason and so on being tools of supremacy, I do understand in a sense where those are coming from.
I understand that too.
I just think that they're coming often from an emotional place. An emotional place I understand. I've lived in that world, and in certain ways still do. But in the end, that both as a matter of professional training and as a matter of reason, I have to reject.
Yes, I should. Thank you for that gentle correction. I mean, I should also emphasize that I do empathize and understand exactly where those things are coming from, oftentimes those arguments. But I think if you begin to think deeply and go a few layers deep, you cannot but accept that we have to have some way of living together.
And I'll tell you a very quick story. In one of the summers I was in college, this is a long time ago, this is back in the 1970s, I was walking alone for reasons that aren't important on a back road I think I was in Georgia. I was either in North Georgia or Southern Tennessee, I can't remember. Anyway, so a car drove by, and the 3 or 4 young white men in the car shouted at me a racial epithet and threw a Coca-Cola bottle, which actually struck me in the head. And my view, looking back on that, is that shouting the racial epithet, although unpleasant, should not be a crime, and throwing the Coke bottle should. That's the distinction that I try to draw on these matters. Saying the racial epithet shouldn't be accepted in polite society, and I hope we think of ourselves as polite society, but throwing the Coke bottle shouldn't be accepted in any society. That's the point.
I have when I was I come from an interracial family, so I have a black sister and a Chinese brother. It's a long story. My mother had 3 of her own children and adopted other children. And when I think this was right around the time that Disney World in Florida was open. Does anyone remember the year that was? It would have been in the late 60s, early 70s, I think. And Disneyland existed in California, and then Disney World opened and it was like 2 or 3 years after it had opened, and our family had decided we were going to go there. So we we get into the Buick station wagon that we had with a rear-facing seat way in the back. That was
We had one of those.
which was such a good, exciting. Me and my brother Dimitri were sitting way in the
You
back.
have one with the wood on the side?
No, we didn't go that far.
The one with the wood on the side.
we had a Buick with a rear-facing seat. We went on a road trip with my family, and my sister Nora, who was she must have been 2 or 3 years old, got a fever, and we were, I think, in South Carolina, and my mother, who's white, my father, we saw this hospital sign, and we pulled off. So this would have been in the early 1970s, and you guys don't remember these kinds of things, probably the students don't, but just as Stephen was saying, they were very real and recent in our history, and we pulled off. Nora was quite sick. We saw the hospital sign. We pulled off to go to the hospital. My mother runs into the emergency room and says, "I have a sick child in the car. Can I bring the child?" You know where it's going. "Can I bring the child in?" And they said, "Absolutely." And my mother comes back to the car and brings Nora in. And of course, a white woman with a black baby in a South Carolina hospital in 1972 at 2 in the morning, this was a non-starter. And they suddenly said, "No, we can't take care of her anymore. You have to go to some other clinic." And my mother wanted to fight. If you knew my mother, you would know it. Wanted so badly to fight, but she had a sick child. And so she's like, "I'm not going to pick this battle right now. I'm going to go to where they tell me." So we drive down to another place now. It's like midnight or something. We get to this clinic, and we go in to the clinic. Now my mother brings all of us in. We go up into the clinic, and there's all, let's see if I get to, I don't want to ruin the punchline. They were all black people in the waiting room, and we go into the waiting room with my sister, and then we come out for some reason. I don't remember the reason. And we go back in, and they're all white, and the reason was that there were 2 doors, and they were segregated waiting rooms in 1972 or 3 or whenever it was in this clinic. So if you don't think we've made progress in our society since then, listening to these stories, now this is not to efface or to minimize the ongoing presence of sort of all kinds of animosity, including racial animosity in our society. But I think we forget sometimes how far we have come and, how far we have to go.
So on that note, I think we should open it up to questions. So there's a microphone over here. So please come on down and ask our speakers some questions. Don't ask me any.
Nobody's going to the mic. Really?
Come on, folks.
I want to hear more Thurgood Marshall stories. I don't know about you guys.
I've got some more. I gave the commencement address at Yale Law School a couple of years ago. It was all Thurgood Marshall stories.
Oh, sure, Lawrence.
So I just have a question about the last observation that you made about you can't deny the fact that our society has made progress. I mean, do you see progress as ultimately kind of, bending in the right direction? Do you see it as unidirectional, that is, there could be little hiccups, there could be little steps back, but ultimately we're moving in the right direction?
Yeah, so I would align myself with MLK 100%. And the last line in my book is that the arc of our evolutionary history is long, but it bends towards goodness. So I argue that both, certainly from an evolutionary perspective, over a 300,000-year sweep of human evolution, we have been progressively shaped to have these desirable capacities, these good capacities. But I think the historical record is quite clear there as well. And here I align myself with people like Steven Pinker and others. I think that the world is getting dramatically better. All indices indicate. Now, it's not better in every place at every moment, right? But in general terms, it is. So yes, I would agree with that. It is getting better.
I would partly agree with it, but the reason for the partly isn't because of any particular substantive disagreement with anything that's going on. It's because I don't think that I have a sufficiently formed vision, even at my advanced age, on a number of issues. So there's some issues where I can't say that moving in a particular direction is progress or not. There's some issues where I feel torn. But I would say there are concrete issues that are better. The air is cleaner, much cleaner. The water is cleaner, much cleaner. The price of prescription drugs, which people think is rising, is falling. It's been falling for years. There's a lot of things like that that are quantifiable, that are really good. And the progress we've made has been enormous. That is, the racial justice issue now is a very different resonance than it did 50 years ago. It was the center of liberal concern, you might say. That's not to say that there's not a lot of racial justice to be done. In fact, I think this is a divide we're a long way from conquering, but it's not what it was by any means. So I do think that generally we make progress, but I also think, while I don't dispute the question of what we may be programmed in a sense for, one still has to work toward these goals. These things don't just happen organically. At least I'm skeptical that they do. One still has to decide, I'm going to pursue this, and because we have a plurality of people with a plurality of interests, one hopes they will pursue a plurality of goals. Problem can arise when everyone decides to pursue the same goal. That is, there's one highest thing one issue we're all going to work on, and a lot of other issues get left by the wayside as we all put all our energy into that one thing. And that sort of thing would worry me a bit.
Can I just follow up on that? I was just wondering if there might be some example of, again, when we're not talking about these relatively easy quantifiable matters, but is there something where in, let's say, a Pinker or a Christakis analysis, this is really for Professor Carter, in which people often talk about progress, in which you would say, I don't see progress there. I would actually say that is not an example of progress.
Yes, there's a number of them,
Yeah.
but the simplest one is in a sense the most obvious one. I think that our trust in institutions and in each other is declining, and that's very worrisome. And those are related but not the same. So the trust in institutions, other than the military, which remains immensely popular, but trust in institutions generally is declining. Institutions matter in a society, especially in civil society, and civil institutions matter. That's not just government institutions and official institutions, but the institutions that both foster and also strengthen and also depend on the various interlocking web of civil relationships that we have. As those die, we become more and more dependent on our relationship with the state. That is, so it's not that everybody has to go to the Elks Club or something like that, but we see ourselves without these mediating institutions as there's us and there's the state. No wonder we obsess about politics all the time, because we don't have as rich a network of other institutions. But at the same time, our trust in state institutions is falling, and it's been falling for a long time, and our trust in each other is falling. And these, I think, are real problems, particularly the trust in each other. The trust in institutions, I think we can overcome. The lack of trust in each other, particularly lack of trust in people with whom we have strong disagreements and so on. The difficulty of saying, yeah, I disagree with him, but he's really a great guy, even though we disagree on this crucial issue, the point of the Thurgood Marshall story I mentioned before. If we lose that, I just think the democratic pretensions are just gone. And that worries me a lot. That's the one issue in which I think we're doing worse. Now, interestingly, Nick, of course, in his book talks about this. He talks about everything. And so one of the things he talks about is, well, we had the Cold War. We had this external issue, and I actually write about that in the civility book as well. And if people weren't alive then, it's hard to describe what it was like to have the first Wednesday of every month at noon, the siren go off, meaning you go hide under the desk to get ready for the possibility of a nuclear attack. These are great.
The countdown clock. Remember they used to announce in the 80s the countdown to nuclear war, and we were afraid. I mean, we were aware that the world might end. When I was in medical school, this was a big issue. Go on, I'm sorry.
No, that's fine. No, that's true. The bold American scientists and their thing about how many minutes away from midnight we were, they still run that, but it's not as interesting now.
They moved it away now, so it's...
But it's you can't imagine, it's hard to imagine what a unifying force that was. One of the things that my father always said was that the reason that his generation was more united across their differences was that because they had done the Depression together and they did the war together. They did the Depression and they all suffered except for a few, and they did the war and they all risked. And so those joint experiences marked them in ways that enabled them to have a certain sense of we're in this together. And then our generation and the next generation comes along and inherits what they built, in a sense. And I'm not talking about inherits the various parts of it that we think are obstacles to justice, but inherits the relative luxury of it. And suddenly we have nothing in common. And again, my book on civility, it is that sense of having something in common that is civility, and that also marks, I think, genuine democracy. If we have nothing in common or little in common with those with whom we disagree, I think we have a very big problem.
I hope I can put my thoughts together well here. I think this paradigm of that we're evolving to be a better society, I don't think that evolution is not normative. It doesn't have a direction that's better or worse. We just change. And I think if you look back in history, you can see societies that were much better than ours. Like, for example, the only one I can think of right off the top of my head, but Ashoka renounced violence as a tool of state in 500 BC, I think it was, or 200 BC or something like that. So I don't think we can just sit back and trust that we're evolving in any one direction. I think we have to, I think it's more. We're going in so many different directions right now. For example, China now with their social control policy, that to me is very worrisome. And so I think I don't think there's any you can point to. We're going in any one direction. Thank you.
On the narrow issue of evolution, you're of course 100% correct. Evolution has no teleology. It's there's no target, so you're 100% right about that. My argument though is that now speaking about prehistorical, like the grand sweep of our evolution as a species, that we have evolved these capacities in order to be able to live together, and that we call these capacities good for the reasons I described earlier. But it's quite possible that with the passage of time, we will evolve other capacities. There's one set of theories that has been advanced that in hundreds of thousands, perhaps millions of years, our species will truly become like ants, that we'll have sterile castes. There'll only be, there'll be worker humans and reproducing humans and so forth. That literally, like that, ultimately is the way that we would become like a superorganism, like ant colonies. For certain reasons, that's unlikely to be the case. There are even some crazy ideas about. Well, actually, I won't say that. But anyway, so who knows? And you and I might look at that and think that's awful, right? But that's how evolution works. So I grant that point. But let's not conflate that statement with the kind of a progressive a view of human history, which again, I'm not a Whig historian. I'm not trying to like re-narrate all, or I'm not Pangloss, best of all possible worlds, everything is great. But I do think the numerical evidence, the evidence about how things have been evolving in worldwide in human societies in the last 200 or 300 years, I think here Steven Pinker is right. I think it's indisputable that everything is getting better. Less war, longer life,
Less slavery.
Air, less slavery.
One of his points and others' points is that slavery was common to every society in the world 1,000 years ago.
And actually what's amazing about the slavery example, which I love, is that it's the triumph of an idea. Slavery was, people argue about this, but I think slavery, it was despite the economics of slavery, not because of it, that slavery was conquered. The abolitionist idea began in England in the 18th century and began to spread, and people began to say the ideas won. There was a debate of ideas. It was like, this is wrong. How can you defend this, etc. And then it spread out from there around the world, actually. There's still some, I don't know if you know this, but there are still about 30 million people, enslaved people in the world today. And that Mauritius abandoned slavery in the 1970s. It was legal. And there's still
they
shadow. Yes,
formally
exactly.
abandoned it. Yeah,
there are like 10 million people who are slaves today in Mauritius, which is insane, let alone all the indentured servitude and other kinds of non-chattel slavery that occur around the world. So I'm not saying that, but it's on the retreat. It's going to go. So yes, I take your point. I think that on the historical timeframes, I think we are evolving to be better in ways that most people would agree are better. And on the prehistorical timeframes, we are just evolving. But the things that have so far evolved are things that also most people would regard as good. I'm often challenged on this point, and I say, the things that I talk about are love, friendship, cooperation, teaching. Which of those things do you not like? And then people get quiet. And I'm like, okay, those are good things,
Thank you for your talk.
We can hear you.
Okay. I'm from Japan, and as a Japanese person, the United States quite seems like an artificial nation. I don't affirm or I don't deny, but anyway, it's kind of created by humans, not like a natural evidence, natural production or something like that. And do you think humans can organize themselves in an artificial, thoughts or according to the artificial philosophy, or do you think to some extent always some natural quality of humanity influences their organization? And do you think it is a progress to increase the extent of the organization based on humans' philosophy or humans' intention?
You start.
Yes, and then you'll follow, right? Okay. So I have two answers to that. First of all, I think that, yes, human beings can organize themselves in any sort of way, any group of humans, subject to these principles that I was discussing earlier. But Japan is a fascinating case. In fact, I used it earlier today. I can't remember in which conversation. One of the things that was amazing about the founding of our country, which is remarkable, is that we believe and committed ourselves to this American ideal that anyone can be an American. It's kind of astonishing. Like, I'm an American and he's an American, and our ancestors came from completely different places. You're an American. I mean, it's really incredible.
Mine came less voluntarily.
Yes, they did, but further back. Correct.
But take the point.
Yes, that's right. But you can't become a Japanese. It's almost impossible to become a Japanese citizen.
Yeah.
And this has to do with certain ethnocentric ideas in Japanese culture and so forth. But in America, we believe that anyone can become an American. You just sort of buy the Bill of Rights, and de Tocqueville writes about this hundreds of years ago, this sort of American ideal. So I think I recognize what you're saying about the distinctiveness of Japaneseness and how it might seem like an alien concept to Japanese nationals that, of course, not everyone can become Japanese, they would say, in the way that we would think, of course, everyone can become an American. But having stipulated that, I do not think that has to be that way. I think actually groups of people can come together and form collectivities, and I don't think they are foreordained by their religion or their race or anything else to be constrained to particular groups.
Although having said that, now I don't claim to know much about Japan, but having said all that, there are lots of countries in the world that are organized culturally in ways where they feel that having a lot of immigration would be a problem, that culture is something that's to be inculcated over a long period of time, and you either are or are not a certain way, and that's common not only to countries but to various organizations and groups of all sorts. We like to limit who gets in. That's part of your in-group bias. We are, if you're right, and we're made to organize ourselves in ways that we can tell, in a sense, who's the friend and who's the enemy, no matter how we counter-define enemies, then it's perfectly reasonable that whole countries could be that way. And it is true that even with our battles over immigration restrictions now, if you look at the number of immigrants that the U.S. admits, there is something unusual about that. But we've also had a long history of very severe restrictions on immigration on various ethnic grounds as well. So it's not as though this was always a trajectory in a particular way. I'm just saying that, but but it does seem to be an organization or society as large as a country can see itself as an in-group. And I think a lot of dangers come from that. When it gets to be the size of a country, a lot of dangers, but it's not obviously not an uncommon phenomenon.
Thank you.
You also can't become Swiss very easily.
Yeah, there's several countries you can't easily.
Maybe I can just follow up on, it's sort of following up on Lawrence's question. I'm just wondering, I think one thing that makes me quite uneasy right now is the thought that given our current politics and the way in which we are uncivil to each other quite a bit more than what I remember in the past, we do see our political foes as enemies. That whatever progress we've made, which is substantial, is extremely fragile in a way that I didn't realize before. I wonder what you guys think about that.
Well, I don't know what Nick would say, but I think that in fairness, I have to say that an upward trend isn't linear. There's all kinds of different relationships you can have, and you can have moments. It may seem fragile in a particular moment, yet the trend can continue in a particular direction. However, I share that fear in a sense. I admit I have a very old-fashioned, and in certain ways, in some certain Whiggian vision of these things. Again, learned from my parents, I think. When people say America is an idea, I actually resonate with that, although sometimes we argue over what the idea actually is. But for the reasons I mentioned, that this tendency to view people as enemies rather than opponents is something that it bothers me enormously. And to go back to Thurgood Marshall again, one of the things I noted about him was his enormous warmth toward members of his own Supreme Court some of whom were chipping away at his own life's work. But on a personal level, he had enormous warmth toward them, and they, in many cases, toward him. He always tried to make that separation of the person. In his day, he would have said the man, but the person and the person's ideas. It didn't mean there were no ideas that were wrong, and even horribly wrong. But his view was that by genuinely getting to know and to like the person, you have a much greater chance of having the actual dialogue. Because if you want to change people's ideas and you don't want to have a dialogue, what you're really left with is force. That's what you can do. You can force people. You can say and force is violence. And in the end, what you're really saying, if you suppress points of view, for example, you're really saying, I would kill to stop this point of view from being expressed. That's what force really is, even legitimate force. That's what always lies behind it. The great legal scholar John Hart Ely used to say, behind every Supreme Court decision stands the 82nd Airborne, you would say. And while it was kind of meant to be funny, he was also making a sharp point about the notion that law works in part. Now, they are bad. I still think the trend, well, I hope the trend, I hope the trend is in the right direction.
I would just piggyback to that because I don't know how much time we have, but I would love to hear Stephen on this.
I think you're going to get the last word.
Oh, well, I was going to ask a question.
Oh.
Actually, not only was I going to ask a question, it wasn't even like a big, broad, interesting kind of en voix question. It's just a narrow technical question. I just can't believe, as I've been watching what's been happening in our government the last couple of years, how many things that I thought were like requirements, like constitutional requirements or laws, were actually just norms. You know, they were just sort of gentlemen's, for lack of a better word, gentlemen's agreements. Like, I can't even believe it. Like, things that I thought that you can't do that. Actually, there's no reason you can't. And so if you get someone in power that's willing not to honor, I thought presidential candidates had to release their tax returns. No, it was just a custom. They always did it, and then some guy said, I'm not going to do it. And, I thought that, when the Congress subpoenas you, like, I can't even imagine the chutzpah not responding. I mean, I've been asking everyone I know. I have a federal judge who's a friend of mine, and I asked him, what would happen if if you ordered someone to do something, they didn't do it. He goes, well, that wouldn't happen. And I was like, that's like a federal judge thinking, like,
Well, but see,
but what if they do? What if the guys just say, I'm not going to
no,
do what you say? What is it? You know, how many divisions has the Pope?
Quick little
divisions? Yeah.
quick little answer. The reason you do it, the reason you obey the federal judge is if you don't obey the federal judge, the federal marshals will come and put you in handcuffs and put you in jail. If you don't respond to congressional subpoena, nowadays all they can do is recommend the Justice Department that you be prosecuted. First, they have to vote to hold in contempt. Then they have to recommend to the Justice Department that you be prosecuted for contempt, which the Justice Department never does, hasn't done in decades, as far as I know.
Even for a private citizen, like I could ignore a congressional subpoena.
Well, when I say could, I mean, again, they could try to put you in jail, but nobody's going to do anything about it as a practical matter.
Oh, what a great! See, there you go. It's another example. I just thought you had to obey congressional subpoena. Turns out you don't have to.
But 100 years ago, Congress had its own prison, and if you didn't obey the subpoena, the marshals would come and get you, and they would lock you up in the congressional. Well, it was more than 100 years because I think they closed, I think, in the 1880s or something. But they would lock you up in the congressional prison until you agreed to testify. That's what they would do. And during the Civil War, this is a big thing. A lot of people got locked up in the congressional prison for refusing to testify during the Civil War. But then they closed the congressional prison. That was their mistake. You see, that if they kept the congressional prison open and had their own force of marshals, then people would go testify because otherwise they'd be thrown in congressional prison. But it's really true. It's not a joke. There was a congressional prison. I don't remember what it was. It's called the Old Capitol Prison, I think, something like that. I don't remember. But anyway, they could arrest you and throw you in, and now they don't.
Right. Thank you so
Actually, just to finish on a good note, I would say, so society's held together by norms
Yes,
and
which
customs
is good,
and
which
civility.
I like customs better than rules. Norms, I should say, better than rules.
Thank you.
Thank
so
you
much.
all.